there's a shift in philosophy, there's a shift in theology, but I think there's also a shift in science.
Well, I'm excited to have the returning guest, Dr. Paul Axton of the Forging Plowshares podcast. He joins me again for a fun conversation. How you doing, sir?
Well, I'm good. I'm glad to be on again with you, Dave.
Yeah, thank you for indulging in this very lo-fi form of technology. I'm happy that I'm able to have conversations of such richness as you've provided when you've joined us, and to do so, I have to admit, with very little notice. But that means you're always in the mindset of a lot of these ideas. I think you're a man who's very concerned about getting precisely into the heart of what it means to be Christian. Is that fair to say?
That's what I'm working on. Yeah, that
Yeah.
it's just the practical side of running a school, and I'm trying to deal with significant thinkers all the time. Uh, the most recently, of course, I've been working with Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. I've been kind of working on Hegel because we are having our next lecture, or one of our lectures this year is William Desmond. I don't know. Are you familiar with Desmond, David?
No, not too much. No. Can you tell me a little bit about him?
Well, he is actually, some would say he's the most significant living philosopher. Desmond, he's a little bit older than I am, but he worked in, he's Irish, but he's worked in the States. He's worked in Louvain, and has taken on the uh, ideas of, in other words, he's kind of gone his own path in that some have called him the last metaphysician. And actually, what that means is that, that for much of philosophy and even theology, uh, the focus has been on deconstruction, on a kind of, anti-onto theology, and in many ways, rightly so. In other words, there needed to be a turn, a philosophical and a theological turn. But Desmond has always, even though he's acknowledged that, he has also uh, gone his own direction. And the way that I would describe it is that it's not that he's Hegelian, but he's returned to a kind of a Hegelian, a reading of Hegel. Um, and that he has reread Hegel, or that he's reading Hegel in a new fashion, and is breaking ground, I think, that he is a fresh voice. I don't know if you're familiar with the radical Orthodox guys in England. They, this is where I did my PhD, was in England under Connor Cunningham, but John Milbank is there. And of course, they then too have kind of been on the side of an anti-metaphysics. And Milbank told Desmond in person, he said, well, actually, William, you proved correct on that. That in fact, there is a Christian metaphysics. And that's kind of the significance then of what Desmond has been doing. And that's been
Well,
my
could you
recent.
define, for our audience's sake, can you define metaphysics, please?
So metaphysics is, just meta, above or beyond physics. The idea, if you go back to arguments like Anselm's ontological argument. This may be the typical argument. It's the ontology of being. That is, that the presumption in metaphysics is that we can take a philosophical being and we can trace our way then to God in and through this philosophical being. So, Anselm's point was to think the greatest thought that can be thought, something than which nothing greater can be thought. And of course, what he's claiming to be doing is that in and through a philosophical understanding, he arrives at God just through pure use of language and reason. And this then actually Anselm's early, but René Descartes then picks up Anselm's understanding of the same idea. The cogito, I think, therefore I am, is actually just a reformulation of Anselm's ontological argument. It's just a neat reformulation. But what is happening in both instances, and this is characteristic of metaphysics of ontotheology, if you think of Descartes' cogito, what he's doing is that he's isolating the thinking thing. He's isolating thought from the world. He's isolating himself from the world, so that thinking is over and against the world. And so he thinks himself out of the world. That's exactly what Anselm did. That Anselm presumed then to make some sort of ontological leap out of the world into God. Now, unfortunately, this is what many people, I think, wrongly have assigned to Hegel. But I think Hegel is, in fact, resisting that. Now, whether he is successful in resisting it, I'm not an expert on Hegel. William Desmond has spent his life reading Hegel, and he's highly critical. But he's also then making a kind of a departure using Hegel then to understand thought and the importance of really, I mean, what he's saying is at a simple level is that the world has been disenchanted by a kind of Cartesian understanding in which we would, kind of science over and against religion, mind over and against body. And there's been a divide, and we kind of, as modernists, we all sort of live in that divide. But of course, that understanding, I think, is that disenchantment that Charles Taylor traces so well. It's not the truth, it's just this age in which we live. We've all been captured by the story that we might tell. And I think our task at this moment is to think ourselves out of the age that we're all just sort of saturated in. And so that's why I've been doing what I've been doing. And that's why probably the piece that you saw me write on David Bohm, that's what I was doing. I was pursuing this understanding that there's a shift in philosophy, there's a shift in theology, but I think there's also a shift in science.
How does this fit with the apocalyptic theological project that folks have been taking up in recent years? Does that fit nicely there, or do you think it's
yeah, it's the same. It's the same discussion, and part of what is meant by, at least when and apocalyptic, actually there's a lot of vagueness surrounding that language. So a lot of people count themselves apocalyptic theologians, and it's, like N.T. Wright would claim to be part of this group. But I really think there may be a misunderstanding of what apocalyptic means. And so apocalyptic has the idea of an alternative world breaking in. And of course, we have to ask, breaking into what? It's not that God breaks into his own creation, but there is a human construct that we put upon the world that in the book of John is just called the world, the cosmos. And so John pictures Christ breaking in to that world of darkness. And so apocalyptic is this breaking in of revelation. The way that this stands over and against an ontotheology or a metaphysics, what we would do in a philosophical understanding is just take the world as we might understand it in a philosophy, like that of Anselm or in like that of the Greeks. Plato is actually who Anselm is using. And we just imagine that we can use human thought to attain to God. But what an apocalyptic understanding is saying, it's very Christocentric, and it's describing then, well, no, God is breaking into this world in Christ and giving us an alternative logic, an alternative reason that is not simply in accord or a continuum with human reason and human thought as we have it, but is in fact a turning that thought on its head. It's a reversal
Right. So
of human.
that's where we get the different words for the meanings for cosmos in the Greek in the New Testament. You're not talking about the universe, God breaking in, like you said, his created universe, but rather God breaking into the man constructed interpretation of what's going on and what's going on.
That's it. That's it. That the cosmos
Right.
is used in two ways by John. There's God's good created world, but when he's using the word cosmos, he's actually talking about a closed system. He's talking about that closed human world that has closed itself off from God.
Yeah, Rene Girard has some interesting ideas here too, where he talks about how the Johannine Logos, the one that John talks about with Logos, is different from the Logos of Heraclitus and all these other kind of attempts to have this comparative religion Logos obviously sometimes fail in that they do not account for the way in which John's view of the Logos is different from this kind of transcendent Logos of Greek philosophy, and that the John Logos or Johannine Logos is eternally expelled, even to this day. It's always expelled, excluded. So the
That's it.
Logos
That's
of
it.
God is always finding very little place to rest his head in the human conversations that we make, right?
I think that's a significance of Girard. Girard gives us the anatomy of this closure. Why we have I think that Girard is always pointing beyond sacrifice and scapegoating and what he's done in kind of this holistic program. He accounts for human culture and civilization and religion on the basis of this kind of a scapegoating mechanism or sacrifice. And it's all, of course, a lie. It's a deception that he sees Christ as exposing.
My audience here, the show we do is called Things Hidden. So we try to use the mimetic foundation as a starting point to go off into other areas. And so, with that said, for the Rene Girard reader, how would you know, what use and what value might the Rene Girard reader or fan find in the work of Desmond and his reading of Hegel?
So what Desmond is doing is, first of all, that we I think we have to take account of where we are. We do have to understand that we live in a world that has been disenchanted. I don't know. Are you familiar with Charles Taylor's picture of a secular age?
Yeah,
So
but go
actually,
everything we try to give, we in our conversations we try to give an entry point for the the casual listener as well as the advanced student in the same conversation, and we usually do a pretty good job somehow. I hope. So always feel free to explain basic introductions and then go into something deep and
okay. Well, I
audience.
think to understand Desmond, it's probably good to understand that he is actually a kind of response to Charles Taylor's picture. And all Charles Taylor is doing in a secular age is just saying, well, it used to be virtually impossible not to believe in God, you know, in maybe 1500 in Western society. But of course, now the opposite is true, that it may be inescapable to not believe in God. That is, that a kind of agnosticism, atheism, and I'm suspicious that even among us Christians, that atheism and agnosticism are actually much more, it resonates much more there, and there's even a flatter Christian understanding. So it's not like you can just step out of this world. And so what Taylor describes is, why is this the case? And he pictures it in terms of the world has closed in on itself in what he calls an immanent frame. And of course, we're all familiar with this at some level, just from scripture, that we don't, that we're just attuned to the world in John's language, to attuned to finitude. And this is the place, maybe money, sex, or fame, or whatever is determinative, or maybe even it's a good, kind of utilitarianism. And of course, that's the picture in Taylor, and actually, it's there in Hegel too. That we're bounded by this kind of utilitarian ethic. And so Taylor calls this the buffered self. That is, that we've closed in on ourselves, that we're, their individualism, a kind of atomistic sense of the self, and we're cut off from history, we're cut off from alternative cultures, and really then an alternative understanding, so that we're, in terms of the matrix, all we see is a singular matrix or a singular possibility. And so the buffered identity is just this, it's a thing that we may not, it's so pervasive and it's so everywhere that we may not be aware that this is definitive of our own apprehension of ourselves and where we're at. But one of the things, one of the markers of this is just the way we experience time. I don't know if this in terms of different cultures, the way that cultures experience time can be very, very different. But of course, the shift is that we've gone to a kind of secular time, whereas the development of a kind of mechanical time or a secular time, that you can trace that. And so now the irony behind Taylor's whole thing, we often say, well, them darn materialists or secularists, but actually his point and Hegel's point, actually, and Desmond is doing a similar thing, is the original effort producing this kind of secular world was on the part of theologians and Christians seeking to protect God from being contaminated with a finiteness or materiality. And so in Latin Christendom, maybe in the late Middle Ages, in the early modern period, that the natural and the supernatural, the supernatural, there had to be an autonomy assigned to God. And so there was a focus on, divine simplicity. And so we can't, theology went bad, and the everything else kind of followed as the picture. And even science, we might tend to blame science, but of course, if you look at all the early scientists, they're all, they're Christians. So Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, they're all working in a theological understanding. But modern science then has also contributed, in a Newtonian sense, especially. And we really, even though we've escaped a Newtonian science, in terms of physics, we really haven't in terms of culture, in that there's still this materialistic, mechanistic, deistic kind of experiential understanding that turns us to not only seeing the world as a big machine, but reason itself, is instrumental. And so, when we say God is dead, you could mean that. And all that Nietzsche meant by that, and by the way, Nietzsche was quoting Hegel, who was quoting Luther. And of course, they all mean something slightly different by God is dead. But I think what Nietzsche actually meant is that philosophically, God is dead. And of course, there's the sense in which he's correct, not just philosophically or religiously, but it just in the sense that, as Nietzsche said, the horizon has been wiped clean, that God as an obvious possibility is that's no longer a living option for many people. And so we've been kind of captured by this secularism, by this understanding
Yeah.
that seems obvious.
So
Um,
that's a great setting of the table for kind of some of the things that I wanted to talk to you about. And I first of all, I think there's this weird link that if we get our anthropology wrong, it'll skew our physics. And if we get our physics wrong, it may skew our anthropology. And down there, it'll mess up our ethics too. So I think all of these things are connected together. Again, I think some of this stuff you can kind of just ascertain by kind of just having an intuitive dance with the text and the story and the meaning of Christianity. And some of it, of course, can be downstream from folks that are dealing with these ideas in more formal academic settings. But I do think that there's something connected to the way in which we view our physics tends to, in some sense, encode violence into the cosmos, like what Paul talked about. And, there's this, like you said, there's this privileging of materialism that we've been dealing with. But at the same time, there's this other error of, monism that says everything is the mind. And I think both of those are dangerous.
so yeah, that we have to bring together body and mind. And maybe that's the significance of Hegel for Desmond. That is that those would be the categories that we're usually working with, that consciousness is in some way over and against embodiedness. And of course, Hegel
Right.
is attempting to overcome that, but so too are many people. We could
Yeah.
approach that through many different avenues, but that's the work that Desmond is doing, is to bring together then this understanding of mind and matter of the world, to a kind of re-enchanting of the world.
And so, with that in mind, you would say probably that both forms of monism that I'm just referred to, the one that says everything is just material processes and the mind is just an illusion of that. And then the flip side, which says, no, everything is mind and the body and materiality are just an illusion. I would assume then you're a friend that you're referring to Desmond, and would reject both of those, right?
Yes, in other words, I
Yeah.
think as maybe a way to a place marker for all of this discussion is the incarnation of Jesus
Right.
Christ. And that is, and even here we can go wrong. And of course, Descartes was a Christian, but I think he misunderstood the incarnation. But I think we're all Cartesian, maybe in the sense that we also then may not understand the significance of God incarnate.
Right.
And that is that the monisms that you're talking about, even as Christians, we still might tend
Yeah.
to favor creation and imagine that everything is creation, or matter or material, or we might spiritualize it and just say,
Right.
no, matter is not real. But of course, what we have in Jesus Christ is the God man,
Exactly. Yeah.
that he is divine and human.
But the problem with that, though, is like you said with Descartes, dualism isn't going to get us anywhere either. In fact, it's probably one of the reasons. It's probably one of the more dominant kind of glued together metaphysical, theistic framework that has made Christianity fall apart
It's
in some
always,
sense.
yeah, we can do a formula here that just
Yeah.
that kind of names everything. That's identity through difference reduces to sameness. And
Yeah.
so
Okay.
we can go with what Hegel called equivocity. Desmond is picking these terms up. Equivocity is difference. That we can focus on the difference, on the dualism, and we can just imagine that you as in a Kantian world, you exist in and through the antinomies, mind, body, soul, spirit, heaven, earth, or Kant comes up with a whole list of antinomies. Uh, so we might be a dualist of some kind. I think that's the usual thing. Or identity through difference reduces to sameness. Sameness, I think, gets us to the East.
Yeah.
But this isn't even, I don't know that that's even a fair characterization because they're all part of the same thing. That is that the drive in difference is to arrive at sameness. Now, this all sounds obscure, but actually, I think Anselm is always a neat illustration of this. Anselm wants to talk about the absolute difference between creator, and creation. And he talks about it in terms of such an absolute difference that you can't even imagine or think. In other words, it's a difference. I've just said a contradictory thing, and Anselm does this. He talks about an absolute difference. Well, there's no such thing as an absolute difference. In other words, two things that are absolutely different are incomparable. They cannot exist in the same space or in the same realm. And so, what happens with absolute difference is that it collapses. Now, this again, it may sound like we're doing philosophy, but I actually think we're doing human personality here too. That we may identify ourselves over and against these people, or them darn immigrants, or uh, in other words, what we miss is the sense in which we are all binary. We are all made up of differences. And so the point is that it's neither equivocity or, univocity. It's neither identity, sameness or difference. But these two things have to be kept alive.
Well, here's the thing, when you have dualism, for example, just to kind of go back to where you were going on that higher cosmological level, the dualism is going to in effect look like a lot of materialism in the everyday because, for example, that's one of the reasons why I have issues with the way Christians and leaders of the church deal with things like social breakdown or whatever. There's no attempt to harmonize and bring into consideration the role of biology and endocrine system and stress mechanism, like Hans Selye was getting at, and incorporating that into the way in which we talk about spiritual disciplines or sins. There's no account for the physics of sin. There's no account for, all of these other areas do not get brought into this conversation. We just say, oh, this is a spiritual matter referring to, hobgoblins and demons, or if you're a psychological flavor of the same thing, then you're just going to psychoanalyze everything into abstractions. And again, you're putting these kind of things as if they're superior to the realm of material concerns, like, well, what's going on with your gut and what's going on with your
Right,
the
right,
mag the frequencies of your body, and
right,
how does this
right.
work to anthropology. I love to bring all of these things into harmonious dance, which is the why my show is so multidisciplinary, because I love to just investigate these same matters with multiple layers at the same time. Of course, it can be kind of confusing for folks who are trying to listen in when there's a lot of stuff set before these conversations happen. But nevertheless, I think that's kind of what you're getting at when you say difference can still get back to drives back to sameness, right? It's like, if you're not having, if you're not, if you're not following the incarnational approach in everything, which does not privilege materiality or spirituality, of one or the other, and it does not ontologically and teleologically situate one before the other, it's very hard to do things in a Trinitarian and a Christian way, isn't it? Without
That's
being careful there, right?
That's it. In other words, and maybe that's what we need to draw back from this language. We're talking about person. We're talking about the personhood of Christ.
Right.
We're talking about the personhood of God. And of course, it's in his person that Christ is divine and human, that he brings together these things, not in some sort of philosophical abstraction, but he is then the God man. And so personhood itself that we imitate, we're becoming Christ-like. That's what's happening. And so we pass beyond this kind of thing that we're caught in philosophically, religiously, the dualisms, it's pervasive. And that's what we're being delivered from, is this struggle between, equivocity and univocity. That describes religions, it describes cultures, but it also describes our own struggle. The way that this gets taken up in theology, just a basic question: how do you know God? Do you know the Father before you know the Son? Or do you know the Father through the Son? Or to state it in a different way, do you read the Old Testament through the person and work of Christ? Or do you read it chronologically as leading up to the person of Christ? And I think the answer for this, in other words, the answer that is given to us in Christ, is that Jesus Christ is the only story of God that we have, and we know the Father through the Son. That's Jesus' message to us. And so the point being that we can never again separate out creation from incarnation, the creator from the creation, in time and eternity. In other words, if this is true of who God is in Christ, then in time and eternity, infinity, those are not separate categories, but they're interpenetrating categories. And this then is that is the resolution philosophically, personally, culturally, theologically.
I agree. So with that established, that's where I have found some amazing, you know, synchronicities and support for what I think has never been truly developed yet, which is what I would call a Trinitarian philosophy of science. Has never been fully developed. And maybe, again, I don't want to speak declaratively, but I've just never seen one. But I'd love to see a Trinitarian philosophy of science that informs physics and works with physics and works with all the other, categories like cosmology and so forth.
And I think that's what somebody like David Bohm, even though he was not a believer, what Bohm is doing, and Sheldrake, Rupert Sheldrake has very much appreciated David Bohm. Sheldrake, of course, is a Christian. I think David Bohm, as a physicist, was really working out the same idea that you're describing. And that is, what would a Trinitarian science look like? Well, one of the things that it would look like that you're getting in high energy physics and quantum mechanics, that Bohm, who as a high energy physicist goes into some detail to describe, is that the universe is not, and it's not little atoms bumping into each other, but in fact, it's in quantum theory, we understand that the person doing the observation actually becomes part of the observation. That is, that he's entering into or bringing about a choice in himself. But the Bohm's point is, yeah, but it's not just a choice that is there in the observer, but what he's observing is in electrons, that there is something like a choice being made, that there is an interaction with the observer, with, as he's observing. This is the whole thing between whether you're measuring location, momentum, is it a wave? Is it a particle? And of course, the way that the observer, it's not just that that there's an ambiguity in his mind, but I think what is being discovered in physics is there is an ambiguity reflected in the universe itself, in physics itself. And Bohm then, I don't think I think many people have noticed this, that, well, it's like there is a mind on both sides of the observation, that the universe doesn't look like a big machine or a mechanical interaction, but it seems like mind is built in to the universe, to creation itself. That shouldn't shock us.
No, I think it's interesting, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation with you, is because I am not very familiar with Bohm, but except through what you've talked to me briefly privately, and then in your references on your show recently, um, uh, Forging Plowshares podcast is. But I have been independently of Bohm, been watching my colleague on my show, Dr. Weiping Yu, and his yuan theory of everything. And I have found it to be a much more elegant and what I would say divinely simple reflection of the divine simplicity of God. And I think that I'm so happy to have conversations with someone who's interested in this topic too, because I think it's um, something that needs to happen more, is this conversation between physics and theology, and what they're going to do together. And I would say that, I don't want to contradict Bohm or any of your thoughts about quantum, but I would just say that perhaps these models that we've had, like the standard model, and we've got all these different kind of exotic components to it, relativity and wormholes and black holes and wave particle dualities and endless types of particles that are just so, and all these different forces. If you look at the totality of it, it looks like a glued together ship with bubble gum, jerry rigged. There's a lot of there's a lot of just so. Well, we've got these many different forces, and none of them are, can be reduced into anything else. And we've got all these multi-universe, multiple universes, and multiverse. We've got wormholes and black holes and time dilations and all these exotic phenomena. But ultimately, a lot of these things are downstream from mathematics. And I think that gets to the heart of something that I have called a problem with physics, which is what I call equationism, or it's just, or you could say, a kind of Gnostic mathematic privilege that has been put into the framework of what we think about physics. But I think epistemologically, we need to back up a little bit and be bold. And I'm not saying you, I'm just saying that we in general, we might need to be a little more bold in testing the epistemological foundations for our faith in the truth of quantum and relativity and the entire standard model, the whole package. We might actually have to start back and look, why do we assume that equations is the first foundation for which we discover what is real? And when we do that, we might realize that there is a kind of mentalism still kind of wrapped behind of things like, for example, one way to look at physics, it looks like, the classic uh, picture that Christians have challenged about scientific or scientism, which is that this is just atomism. Here we go again. We've got monistic atomism. And then I think the problem, though, is that now with quantum, we've moved towards, well, no, it's all in the mind again. Here we go, guys. We found it. It's all in the mind. And I think we're still trapped in the same problem if we assume that the current reigning models of physics should continue their reign. And I think one of the problems with this conversation in general is that folks who are theologically trained still defer, maybe out of epistemological humility, to the physicists and the mathematicians to speak with authority about what physics is all about. And in that sense, they're kind of revealing that they're still kind of trapped in a kind of dualism. You know what I mean? Like, well, who am I to question Einstein? Or not me individually, but just the project of theologians bumping into this category. Who am I to question quantum physics? Who am I to question these things? I'm talking about the domain of the spirit, and obviously, I need to defer to the world of the physicists who have got all their equations worked out beyond anything I can try. And I think that's a little bit, we need to be pushed back against that instinct a little bit. And I think we need to be a little bit more bold in looking for the Trinity, actually, in the handiwork of creation.
Yeah. I think I don't think you're saying anything shocking there, and that is that, uh, of course, the mathematical model we all recognize is simply that, and it's limited by the particular math that you may be using. And so I
Right,
think, and so I think that that's part. In other words, the thing is not to take away from that there's a reality there, and that this reality is in some way that we need to use the word here, comprehend, but we need to use it in a with a twofold sense.
yeah,
We can understand the world like we can know another person.
right,
But I think the drive in mathematics, the drive perhaps toward a unified field theory, may miss the fact that there is an eternal depth or infinite depth to the physical world. In other words, this is kind of what Sheldrake is saying in biology, in plant biology. This is what Bohm is saying in physics.
yeah,
That whereas, we're continually looking for causal laws to explain everything, uh, and to break it down, into units. But the idea is that, well, that sort of comprehension, a total comprehension, the universe is not reducible to that any more than a person is reducible to being totally comprehended. In other words, that's not the kind of world that we live in. Of course, some people don't believe in persons or personhood, but as Christians, we believe that personhood is ultimate reality, and that ultimate reality is reflected in the created order. And so we encounter the person of God, not in some reductionistic sense, but in the sense that that we're encountering something of infinite depth
right.
in creation.
I would say that a lot of what we have considered to be reigning paradigms of physics are actually physicists with much more social clout and academia taking credit for things that engineers and chemists actually developed. And so what what I would say is that engineering and chemists, folks who are working with things incarnationally, are much closer to the truth intuitively of the incarnational reality that we're in than the mathematicians that we call physicists today.
I think
Theoretical
that,
physicists is
yeah,
what I'm
yeah,
calling.
I think that's the understanding behind, the
Now I
set.
know what I'm saying right now is very scandalous for a lot of folks that are in the world of the physics world. They'd be very mad at me for saying these things. They'd say, "Whoa, whoa, 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 whoa!" There, but I'm just trying to just kind of loosen us up a little bit and flex, just stretch a little bit and say, maybe it's not, because in other words, my my background here in talking about this is that Dr. Yu, my co-host, and again, I'm not expecting you to be familiar with what he's all about, but he has always explained physics and the way the world works in a way that a 5-year-old can understand, truly.
Uh,
And that confounds the wise. And whenever I see the worldly wise confounded, I always feel like it doesn't necessarily mean it's true, but if I had a metal detector looking for the truth, I've got a little more beeps right now. So I'm always a little bit, well, let's see what's going on there. And one of the things that Dr. Yu has done in his book that he's going to be releasing soon, and I've been in conversation with him over the course of him writing it for some years now, is he's going to provide a rewrite of all the equations, Maxwell, just rewriting Newton, a whole host of things. He's going to provide the equations, but he doesn't like to start there. And because he believes that that is fundamentally not the way we should do physics. We should do physics by observing the way the world actually is and the way the world actually functions in reality. We should look at objects and we should play with them. And when we play with them, we can look for patterns for how they behave, and we can look for conclusions as to how they actually are operating on a physical level. And that always has irritated Dr. Yu's, establishment physicist reality whenever they've interviewed. I've put them in conversations on my show of the year with the big ones, Dr. Brian Greene and Michio Kaku and all these big stars. And I don't
uh,
want to speak about anybody individually, but just the general thought is, oh, if you want to rewrite everything foundationally like this, you need to be in the peer review papers. Well, exactly. The peer review papers are all ran by people who have already assumed as a founding principle that the establishment models are correct. So it's a kind of priestly caste that we're actually dealing with functionally that has rigged the game for actual. And this is a mimetic rigging. It's not an intentional, like a conspiracy. It's a mimetic rigging that we tend to do with any kind of body of knowledge, which is that you know, a lot of the prestige that we put behind these icons and these foundational experiments that have supposedly settled the reality of things like wave particle dualities and all of these different kind of exotic things that people just treat as real because people with prestige say they're real. A lot of these things are just endless layers of mimetic prestige. When you actually look at the arguments that they've made, if you actually look at the evidence that they've presented, it's not very strong at all. But they have a lot of prestige, and that prestige builds on itself internally within the topics, the subjects, and then it spills out into the rest of the world. I say because one of the reasons why physics reigns supreme in science in general, I call it the Mowgli effect. When we were having the atom bomb, whatever field is the knowledge field that created something that could destroy the world, just like Mowgli in the Jungle Book, whoever could tame fire was the one that
yeah.
would rule the jungle. And in this case, whoever's field of knowledge could create something to destroy the world over, they're going to be encased in the holy of holies of thought, and therefore, they get caught up in this kind of abstract world that is actually, in some ways, more delusional than the science that is actually much more closer to reality, like I said, chemical engineering or biological, understanding or engineering, and how that actually works.
You understand, David, you're describing in part the work of Thomas Kuhn.
Exactly. Yeah.
Uh, that that's the way, in other words, that's the way normal science works, but that's the way normal anything works, is that there's paradigms, there's hypotheses, and either, if you want to be a scientist, you have to buy into the reigning paradigm. And of course, that's the problem with both Bohm and Sheldrake. They kind of got kicked out of
Exactly. Yeah.
the scientific community because they're working from a different, an alternative paradigm. Bohm has referred to his understanding as a postmodern science in that he thinks that we should not separate matter and consciousness, facts, meaning, and value, but science should there should be a wholeness, a unity. He talks about an intrinsic morality, a virtue. Well, that's not the way that scientists aren't used to thinking in those terms. And so he's talking about, well, there needs not just an Einsteinian, Einstein is actually still very much part of a Newtonian world, but the idea is, well, we need to integrate many areas of understanding, and that there should this understanding of a unified, not just a field, but that there is an embracing unification in which things work together. Doesn't mean that we can comprehend that working together, but with that understanding, I mean, that's part of the field theory that unfolds in physics. Now we understand, oh, it's not a bottom up thing, but it's a top down thing. We understand the smallest particles not in and through an examination of an ever and ever smaller atomistic world, but in and through understanding in terms of a field, of an overarching unification. And so I think that's the sense that
Yeah.
Bohm picks up Hegel and sees Hegel as laying this out, that that uh, he read Hegel's logic again and again. I think what Bohm may not have recognized in Hegel, and what many people, because many people just think he's heterodox, but Hegel's very much, I think, working, and I'm not saying he got it right, but at least he is attempting what you are describing. Hegel is very much concerned to work out a Trinitarian understanding in reality.
Yeah.
And he accuses his own contemporaries, clergymen. He says, I think if you'd go to any of these of their churches and ask them, do you really believe in the Trinity? He thought that they really didn't, and that's exactly what he's aiming at. That is, that he's basing a
Yeah.
philosophical thought in this Trinitarian understanding. And I think that's precisely what Bohm maybe didn't recognize the depth of Hegel's Christianity influencing him, but I think he appreciated that the Hegel's philosophy without understanding its ultimate identity,
Yeah.
person of Christ.
Well, that's the very interesting thing. There's a reason why I want to have this conversation again. There's no real place to land the plane here. We're just chit chatting, and it's been fun because this is an ongoing project of mine, and I know it is of yours too. But I wanted to talk with you just to kind of put a marker in time of having this call together because I think it's the beginning. This conversation I hope is the beginning of many many conversations that would be more like this, and I've set some foundations that may be scandalous to again a lot of folks who believe in the establishment model of physics, and folks who would even be renegades about the establishment model of physics might find my departure even more scandalous. Like, my goodness, I thought I was a renegade. Then I see what David is suggesting and what Dr. Yu is suggesting, and I say, my goodness, now they really are, going against the grain. But I say all
And
that just to say that there's a mimetic component. The mimetic component puts undue prestige around these models that I think don't hold up when you actually want to really bear the brunt of real scrutiny of the evidence, so to speak, of these foundational things. You were
yeah,
saying
yeah,
something. Sorry.
yeah. No, I think that's it. We all get stuck.
Right.
Uh, and it's not, that's the problem with mimesis. It's more powerful than we might imagine.
Yeah.
And we do. We all need models. We need to break. I don't think we should imagine that we can just free ourselves of that. But I think we do need to recognize, oh yeah, that obviously standard areas of thought and study
Yeah.
and by the way, theology is no different in this because I don't know if you've gotten the point here, but we're also describing a theological understanding that is simply has not been the accepted understanding. Uh, I mean, it's more accepted in Eastern Church than it is in the West, but almost absent in a Western theological understanding.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. The theory that the foundation that I am working on is one in which, if you look at my colleague Dr. Weiping Yu, this is someone who you know comes from a culture that was all of his young life was not had anything to do with what we would call Christianity or Western thought, and that kind of atheistic or agnostic secularism is what kind of is the foundational worldview of my colleague Dr. Yu, at least in his foundation and in his development of the Yuan theory, had no connection to, at least in his conscious mind, towards any kind of Christian or Western influence framework. So,
In other words, I don't think, I think that the deeper that people go, and the more that they understand things, that we encounter God, whether we want to or
exactly.
not.
Exactly.
Oh,
That's what I'm getting at. So this is the
yeah.
miracle that I wanted to talk to you about. Is that if you I'm gonna kind of leave it on a cliffhanger on my side of things, and then we can wrap up on your insights there. But I have not studied Hegel in any close depth at all. And so, hearing you talk about Hegel looking for a Trinitarian kind of physics or science, philosophy of science is very intriguing to me and very, whether I agree with what he's saying or not, it's very comforting to know that a figure of that, stature and history is looking in the same direction that I am. And I will look into his work. And David Bohm is again someone that you've introduced me to, but these were all independently of this investigation that I've been on, watching Dr. Yu's work and his development. And I'm going to leave it with this, which is that, his model has one particle. That's it. One
Mm.
type of particle. Now, when we look at something like the current model, let's say if we want to look at quantum physics, quantum physics is based on the existence of an orbiting electron. And an electron is based on the assumption that if you have two electrical charges, you would have two distinct particles. But what Dr. Yu would call monocharged particles, singularly charged particles, which would, proton, electron, neutron. But when you look at those things, right, I had to go and use my friend Dr. Iain McGilchrist's insight to kind of break through my kind of, you know, uh, I was kind of stunned because I was like, well, Dr. Yu, what was the evidence of having monocharged particles? And he basically said we just assumed it. We just assumed because we had two distinct electrical charges, then therefore there must be two distinct particles carrying those charges. So we had these protons, neutrons, electrons. And I said, that sounds like a very left hemisphere dominant thing to do. Is to chop the plate up. If you're looking at Iain McGilchrist's description of right hemisphere versus left hemisphere, dominant ways of thinking in the brain, left hemisphere, is reflective of the Western plate, where you have your vegetables on one part of the plate, your meat separated on another part, your fruit or whatever, everything's separated. And the right hemisphere sees things more holistically, and you can see it reflected in the Chinese plate where the noodles and vegetables. I know these are silly things, but it helps people illustrate the point, which is that the right hemisphere tends to see things holistically interconnected, like a dish might look like in the East. And so, with that in mind, when you look at the assumption that if there's a positive charge and a negative charge, there should be a proton and a neutron and an electron. That is an assumption that is a left hemisphere dominant kind of assumption to make. Once you put that presumption baked into the cake, you end up creating an entire field like what we have with quantum physics, which is based on the assumption that the electron, a singularly charged negative charged particle, exists, and that it is this perpetual motion machine-like apparatus that, again, is something that comes from a Newtonian mechanistic model. So I'm not asking you to agree or disagree with what I'm saying. I'm just kind of illustrating my point here, which is that we have to have a little bit of courage to go bolder and kick the tires and not be afraid of credentialism or equationism or these other things that I think are mimetically propped up that hold us back from a much more beautiful, perhaps, model of the Trinity in nature. And here's where I see the Trinity in the image of God reflected in the concept of Dr. Yu's muon particle. His model has one particle, one force, one field, one law, one universe. There's no just so 47 different subatomic particles and quarks and neutrinos and God particles and Higgs boson, all these theoretical mathematical points that you get when you use math as your foundation of the universe, which would privilege the mind over the body, which would be against the Trinity and incarnational truth. So if we're going to just take, and again, he's not using these axioms, but it just fits so beautifully with the axioms that I've been searching for in the universe, which is something that does not privilege mind over body or body over mind. And that's what you get with Dr. Yu's model, which is this: one particle having both positive and negative pole, which means like a little magnet, has a north and a south pole. He calls it the muon, the universal particle. So the first principle is that matter has always existed. Materiality in this particle has always been a real thing. It's not an illusion like you get with quantum and other types of ideas that talk about these mathematical constructs that are not actually real, that would kind of lend itself closer to Gnosticism, in my opinion, or some kind of other type of mysticism like Kabbalah. What we have is real particle, a real mass having real weight and mass, real form, and this has always existed. The second principle with this, these are principles that I've derived in describing his model. The second principle that has always existed is magnetism, is where we would get the corollary for the concept of consciousness. Magnetism does not come ontologically prior or after the magnetic particle. They are always eternally coexistent. One is not the source of the other, and they all are interpenetrating together. And the third principle is the relationality of this dipolar magnet and its magnetism in relationship to all other particles in the universe, and what Dr. Yu describes as a magnetic fluid medium. It was what they used to call ether. He calls it a magnetic medium that has a fluid-like properties, very similar to what I would see in Genesis 1, where he talks about the watery depths that the Spirit of God hovers over. And so from this foundation, you don't have to have anything else in terms of other just so fields and forces and everything. Everything he explains, magnetism, magnetic particle, and the relationality between those poles within that particle and the poles of all other particles that are exactly the same. And these particles are infinitely divisible, and they're infinitely combinable into every type of form that we see in the universe today.
Hmm.
So if I was to bias this, again, just starting out with a very abstract, we've got what looks like, if it's true, again, if this theory is correct, we have a divinely simple model of the universe to start sketching out with. And number two, we have something that reflects the image of God in his Trinitarian nature that are the things I just described. We have mind, body, and spirit, the relationship between the two, and this relationship between God and his created order. And all of these three elements, and I'm trying to use these things because I'm not describing God, I'm describing the physical, the science of physics that should reflect the image of God. And so when I describe these three characteristics of Dr. Yu's theory, there's no other characteristics that I need to insert before I've got the entire picture set up foundationally for every other force, every other aspect of the universe, galaxies, hot dogs, consciousness, relationships, human beings, personhood, the whole thing. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
no, I like the relational aspect to it. I think that has to be the case that we're talking about. I think that's what is that people peering into this see. No, that's very interesting, David. Um, the thing that I don't, did you read the piece I did on McGilchrist?
No, I haven't.
Well, I had kind of left, I hadn't read McGilchrist, but of course, McGilchrist himself turns to Hegel and uses Hegel's word that he actually got from Luther, that is Paul's word, to describe the suspension of the law. Aufhebung in German, Katargetai in Greek. And maybe this is what you're describing. That is that apart from suspending a kind of left brain, law-based, kind of theoretical principle structure, apart from suspending that and turning only in suspending that do we get the fullness of personhood in a what McGilchrist calls a right brain orientation. And so maybe that's exactly what you're describing in a physical sense.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that I just want to leave this as a teaser is that from that foundational principle, three tripartite principle that I've just elucidated in describing my friend's physics theory, I think provides us with a really exciting foundation for Trinitarian philosophy of science and a whole host of other different downstream insights. If you look at that, just again on the surface level for a second, you see that Trinitarian framework operating in all the different areas like we're talking about. For example, when I said the body and the soul and the spirit, don't you agree with my suspicion there that the spirit is the relationality between the body and the soul, as well as the relationship between other persons around us, right?
I think I not only agree with that, but I think that Paul's use, in other words, when Paul's talking about in Romans 7 and 8, and he's talking about the Trinity, he's talking about an applied Trinity, applied to human persons. That is, that not only is God Trinitarian, but those of us created in his image are Trinitarian in what you're describing. And Paul describes then, the a tripartite self. First of all, he describes it absent the Spirit. What do you get? Well, that's Romans 7:7 and following, where Paul is pitted against himself. And then you add the Spirit, and then you have this self that is part of the body of Christ, relating to God, other people, and actually there is then a wholeness of self-relation in this fulfilled. We're all Trinity in that sense, but there can be we can actually trace the absence of God in human personality at least, and then what that personality looks when filled in with Trinitarian relationship.
I like that. Would you agree? Excuse me. One thing that I've been kicking around a lot when I'm working on this because I'm writing this down. I've been working on what I call the Trinitarian philosophy of science or Trinitarian physics, whatever. And again, I'm just looking at Dr. Yu's theory, which he's not interested. He's his project. He's not doing anything with theology. He's not doing anything in that world. So I picked that up and I'm just looking at it and I'm saying, okay, how does this connect with what we say about the Trinity? And it fits like a glove so far. One area that could be a little bit of I don't know controversy. I mean, the whole thing is controversial to say these things, but would be Dr. Yu believes that there's no Big Bang, that that these muon particles, these little magnets with magnetism inherent to them, and magnetism and the magnetic particles that carry them in the relationship between them and other infinite uh, varying muon particles that make up the universe. This fluid, he believes, has always existed. And so he rejects the Big Bang model and all those things. And yet, so I would look at that, and on the surface, you might say, well, we got a contradiction here because most people believe, like somehow the Big Bang is somehow supportive of a Christian Trinitarian sense of the cosmos. But I don't actually disagree. I think that the Big Bang is another part of the problem that you've described earlier, which is that you're privileging matter as a second step to the spirit. And when you do that, no wonder we have such a violent view of the way we treat human persons and Earth, right? Because as long as we believe in the Big Bang, it then logically follows that spiritual matters trump fleshly matters, including the value of a human person and their life. The reason why people roll over and allow people to get ground to the dust and murdered little children in Gaza is because they believe the Big Bang exists. If the
There's
Big
a
Bang
yeah,
exists,
yeah.
if the Big Bang exists, therefore, why do we shouldn't really care as much about flesh? Because where the world of the spirit comes into play, that obviously is more fundamental reality than the world of the flesh, which is what the Big Bang is saying. There was nothing. If you take the Big Bang and glue it to God, or vice versa, whatever, you get that kind of violent view of a reality that we have today. And so Dr. Yu throws that out, thank God. So we're closer to the Trinity. But then you say to yourself, but Dr. Yu, are you or David aren't, because it's not Dr. Yu doing the Trinity connection, it's me. But Dr. David, aren't you gonna get us into trouble here if you try to say matter has always existed? Don't we say that and so here's my thought here, which is that the matter has always existed insofar as God has always been creating, not because he has to, not because necessarily so that he has to create, not
Mhm.
that it's a part of God, but rather it's just his divine will that he has always been creating. And I think about that and I say, if Christ, the eternal Logos, is eternally begotten, not that he needed creation, but rather, if you have a begottenness, it seems to imply that you have some kind of place in which you're begotten into. And so, if I look
That's
at
it.
the if I
Yeah.
look at the watery void in Genesis 1, that's the place in which God has always eternally begotten the Logos, and the relationship, of course, of God the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit has always been eternally creating, eternally. And so, therefore, it's not that. So, creation, in some sense, does not have a chronological beginning. It's always been something that God has so desired to create as he has always existed. Do you see that?
That, yeah, yeah, you understand what you're describing theologically is origin of Alexandria, but also I think it's there in the early church. It's pervasive. And that is they did not hesitate to assign an eternality to creation that I think often gets misunderstood. And it does resolve again around the identity of the Logos. In other words, one way of identifying the Logos is to talk about the Logos, Jesus Christ, not as the incarnate Christ, but some people read that passage in John or read the New Testament as saying that Christ pre-existed that what we're actually talking about is a pre-existent Christ. And so they separate out the incarnate Christ from the pre-existent Christ, and they talk about the incarnate Christ as a kind of secondary reality. But the way that the early church understood this, and this Hippolytus, in fact, talks about creation beginning from the cross, and that it unfolds both backward and forward. In other words, they didn't hesitate to bend time. They weren't tied to some sort of chronology. And when we talk about Christ, Jesus Christ, as the Alpha and Omega, we're talking about an encompassing of time by eternity and not a separating out of time from eternity. Actually, this is even there. We tend to read, Genesis chronologically in the beginning. But of course, in the beginning was Jesus Christ. In the beginning was the Logos. This is not a beginning that unfolds in some sort of chronological sense, but it's a beginning that unfolds from this person. And so,
Yeah,
yeah,
it's an
I think that
existential beginning. It's an ontological beginning, right? Is that how you would
that's
say
it.
it?
That's it. And so God has always been creator. That's not something that's added on to his identity. God has always been the Father of the Son. That's not an add-on. That God, and so once you say that, then you can talk about the cross as an eternal fact about God. You can talk about the incarnation as an eternal fact about God. This is John Behr. I don't know if you're familiar with John Behr's work, but Behr is just going back to, he's Eastern Orthodox and he's going back to a patristic understanding. And his point is that among the early church fathers, there was no disincarnate Christ. That concept never occurs. That's an add-on, that develops later. And it's very much, of course, with a Greek sensibility that in some way, they're equating the logos with Platonic
And,
logos.
and as far as I understand, there's no, and again, I know, I'm not expecting, I'm kind of breaking this idea to you as we're talking. So I'm not expecting you to agree or not agree or whatever. But as far as I understand, there's no model of the physics of the universe except for Dr. Yu's Yuan theory that more adequately, simplistically accounts for that very phenomenon. That that there is eternally existing, and it's not eternally because most of these models today again assume this Big Bang model, or even if you go back to these more older forms of eternally existing universe, they tend to privilege the mind or matter over one another. Dr. Yu's theory does not do that. So it's eternally existent, it's eternally Trinitarian in its structure, and it's eternally relational. It's eternally interpenetrating. Not the matter. The magnetic particle is not mother to magnetism, and magnetism is not mother to the magnetic dipole particle. And the relationality of the dipole particle in relationship to its two poles, north and south, or positive, negative, is not, again, it's all intrinsically one particle in relationship to infinite other particles that are exactly little magnets as well. So it's divinely simple and it's eternally existing. And as you've just verified to me, what I have said here does not contradict any dogmas of the church that I'm aware of, which is great to know because you never want to have any opportunity for people to get, heresy going.
I should warn you, though, that of course they condemned Origen as a heretic in the Fifth Ecumenical Council.
But you
They,
didn't condemn the other church fathers, did they? That you said also shared this view. So,
yeah, no, no, I'm just, that's not it. They chopped off Maximus's hand and tore out his tongue.
for saying
And
this very thing, Lord have mercy.
not on this thing, but Maximus is agreeing. In other words, that there is a tradition in the church. Maximus about 500 AD. I think that you can trace it, up and through Bulgakov, the Russian Orthodox theologian. And so there is this tradition, but in other words, the point I'm making is that the understanding that we're describing here would be very much heterodox in regard to the way that most Christians in the West have understood, because we've tended to read
Oh,
all.
I know, but it's not actually violating any actual dogmas, is what
No,
I'm saying.
no, no, I don't think so. I
That's
don't
what
think
I'm saying. It's
so.
heterodox insofar as how we've gone astray, yes, but it's not actually in violation of any of the actual dogmas of the early of the church, right?
I don't think so. I don't
Yeah.
think so.
So I'm excited because I can't, I do think that I don't know. I try to be, very, I want to be very cautious not to get people, because I know how it is when you say these things. People just get so mimetic either way, and I can be mimetic and all this, but I really believe we're going to see something very special as Dr. Yu's theory starts to catch on to more and more people, and when his book comes out, because I think we're going to have, for the first time, in my opinion, the most elegant, divinely simple Trinitarian explanation of physics that we've ever had so far. And that it's not a theological work, it's a physics work. So he's only looking at the way in which matter and the way in which matter relates to consciousness and the way in which it relates to other aspects of materiality. But it's going to be the closest thing we've had. And so I'm excited to write a companion book alongside Dr. Yu's book independently. He doesn't even know this, but it's something that I've been working on to be able to explain the first time the Trinitarian, model of
Uh-huh.
the philosophy of science that I believe we have here with him. And I think it's only going to, like you just said, I on the big picture of things, I don't think we're in any. I'm not in any violation of any of the essential dogmas of Trinitarian theology or the Nicene Creed.
Yeah, early Christians certainly didn't have our view of the universe, and did not have our view. They weren't reading the story in Genesis the way that we tend, and
Ex
some.
nihilo is something that came later, right?
It is, and what is meant by that, is even that then needs some unpacking as to how that understanding unfolded. But in other words, the way we tend to read it heretically, and unfortunately, I think this is somebody like William Lane Craig, that he reads ex nihilo as if nothing is something, but nothing ain't anything. And that's the ex nihilo. It's creation, but there's nothing before. In other words, our problem with ex nihilo is we want to get to the nihilo. We want to identify the nihilo as if that's a decision. Craig would locate that in a decision in the mind of God, that at some point in eternity God made up his mind to create, and so there's a change in God. And so that there is a more sophisticated understanding, I think, even with the development of the doctrine of ex nihilo.
Really cool. There's another aspect here. I've explored, which is that I said, well, Dr. Yu, is your theory actually closer to Taoism than it is to Christianity? And it turns out it's not, for a variety of reasons. But one in which that I think is really beautiful is that, and he said this again using just material physical arguments, but I'm looking I'm always having a bifocal lens when I'm listening to him. I'm always putting on my theological layer of my bifocal with my scientific layer with his language. And he said that, basically, as he will explain in his book, that attraction tends to be the more dominant force in the universe versus repulsion. So that there isn't this kind of perfect dualism of attraction and repulsion within these little magnets that I've just set up earlier. That these little magnets that God has created and that exist in all of our bodies and exists with our thoughts. Each thought has its own magnetic frequency. And this way in which we relate is very reflective of positive and negative. When you think about male and female, attraction, repulsion, all these different things, hot, cold, night, day, that it isn't actually a perfect symmetrical dualism. If you actually look at the model of the way in which the nature is described in Yuan model, it is slightly asymmetrical. It's symmetrical, but then it's slightly asymmetrical. Just like beauty looks symmetrical, but if it's too symmetrical, it can be repulsive, and if it's too asymmetrical, it can be repulsive. It's that symmetry with a slight asymmetry that actually is what attracts us typically. And it's the same thing in nature, that actually attraction is more dominant as a force because of the way in which magnets actually operate when you play with little magnets as an example. That actually it's attraction that is actually a more dominant force. And so if we were to map these things out, love,
Mhm.
obviously, love wins. And love is the dominant force of creation. Love is the fullest force of creation. And that which we call repulsion is not inherently evil. But what we perceive as evil is, I guess you could say, in some sense, um, characteristic of both attraction and repulsion, just like mimetic desire is, or just like anything is, But that this actual idea of attraction, of things coming together in a kind of state of harmony, is actually the way in which the universe materially actually prefers to tend towards.
Yeah, yeah, I think that we can name that attraction, that we can give it the name that you've done, that there is an ultimate attraction, an ultimate attractor, that God is drawing all things together up
Right.
into himself.
When I am lifted up, I will draw all men unto me. Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
And that is, of course, a direct reference to the cross. I mean, I think John explains that it's the cross, but you could take it as the motion of from the cross to the resurrection to the ascension. That is, that there is this universal thing at work in Christ, and it shouldn't shock us to
yeah.
discover and this is again Maximus. Maximus takes, well, there's the logos, but then there is the individual aspects of the logos that are there in all of creation that are the logoi. I think you should look, David, at Maximus's use of the term logoi, because that's very much what you are describing. And that is, in each logoi, there is the sense that we encounter the fullness of the logos, that in each particular thing, there is a mirroring of the whole. In other words, it's not that one thing is cut off from another,
Exactly.
but that this is Paul's use of the letter. The letter that kills is that letter that has been cut off.
Yeah.
But the living letter, Paul says, you are the letter of Christ. That is, that each of those Corinthian Christians, I think he's writing to all of us, that we each then are Christ, that we each, there is in this sense, the theosis, the idea that we're all being divinized, that we all carry, and that we should see this divinization as working in and through all creation.
Right. I think you would agree also with what I was saying about the watery fluid, right? That this idea, it's the Theotokos, the mother of God, is a picture of that, right? In the sense of this, of the womb and the waters of the deep, of the darkness, right? And then you have this excitation of the medium, which creates light, right? And that's what you see when you see today's modern little videos of the moment of conception. You see light in the darkness of the watery depths, and you see that in the creation story here. You know, this idea of, and that's what Dr. Yu's magnetic medium. He describes it as fluid. He's not looking at Genesis 1. He's devising it from pure the study of God's creation as someone who isn't even a believer in any of that. So it's amazing how you can uncover these truths in different directions, you know.
Well, I think the water, I wouldn't put too much weight on that. I think it's an interesting metaphor.
Yeah. I'm
Um,
not saying it's literally water, H2O. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
I
I think
mean the
the
fluid like
water,
nature of it. Yeah.
huh?
I just mean in the fluid like nature of the
Right,
medium.
right, right.
Yeah.
And interesting that's one of Bohm's favorite illustrations is the way that, you can have a stream of water and a little wave, or that our tendency is to separate out and divide out from the stream. But he's saying, well, we need to look at the overall stream of things. So I think it's a neat metaphor. I think in Genesis, actually, it may be that the water is functioning there with a kind of dual purpose because it's the chaos of the waters
Yeah.
that are brought under control by the hovering Spirit of God.
The chaos of unlimited eternal potentiality, right? In that sense. Would you say that?
That's certainly a possibility. In other words, I think a part of it is it's written over and against religious myth as we have it. And in the religious myth, the chaos is productive.
Right.
I don't think in Genesis the chaos is productive. There is
Yeah.
things that arise out of the chaos through the word of God, but the chaos itself, in other words, the way this is divided up in most myth, that we're actually talking about uh, the gods, in a war or in a battle, and that
Right.
and of course, I think Genesis is demythologizing in that sense.
I would just say, and this is just my reading, so tell me if I'm wrong here. I see that as the infinite potentiality of creation, the infinite unknown. You know, I mean, that's what the sea is representative of in Scripture, as the ocean and the sea is always representative of these of this infinite unknown, the chaos of the unknown, the chaos of that which is not understanding, or you know, the infinite
Yeah,
potentiality
yeah,
of the
yeah,
nations that exist beyond where the people of Israel knew of at the time, all represented in the concept of the sea. I don't see that as inherently violent or productive as you're describing. I would say it is just the chaos of unlimited potentiality, right? I mean, every day we're faced with that. Every day we are made in the image of God, and we can have infinite choices in the way we act. I can go and climb a tree right now. I can throw my phone against the, the wall.
yeah,
The wall. This infinite potentiality, which tends to create stress when you don't put your faith in Christ. That creates stress, which is the foundation biologically and physiologically and psychologically for sin. Because you tend to sin, you tend to miss the mark of your potentiality when you become stressed by the infinite possibilities of what you could be doing in some sense.
yeah, yeah. I like it. I like it. Yeah, there's an infinite depth to creation, and that
Yeah.
I think that's very much reflected there in Genesis, and it's certainly reflected in the notion that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That there is an infinite depth in that the Creator has come into his creation.
And the word with there indicates the Holy Spirit, right? Right
I
there.
yeah, yeah, clearly that there is the working of the Spirit throughout the life of
Yeah,
Christ.
because if you think about it, you can't have language without implying the Trinity, even in language. Like if you write, you know, you have I, first person, you, second person, and third person is he, she, they, them, right? That implies a Trinitarian structure, right? You cannot say I without there being, you know, I, and then you have you, And then when you say he or she or they or them, the third person, that implies that there's already a first and second, which would mean that would be the third person. So there's a Trinitarian structure involved in language itself, right? You can't have a he if there isn't a sense in which you're speaking about somebody who's not there, right?
You understand that's the Lacanian take on language. In other words,
I know that.
there is a Trinitarian structure to language, and I think Paul is describing it. But understand that language per se is deadly. In other words, that's the if we just imagine that it's all contained in the letter, in the
Right,
word, in the letter
right.
per se. So the Trinitarian structure is the Trinity. I would say that. In other words, that God fills this out personally. It's not that language is, I think that's the philosophical mistake that we may imagine that in language per se, that God dwells in. And so I think that's what Paul's description of the letter is. There's a letter of the law, of scripture, of language that kills or is deadly because it's taken to be an end in and of itself.
Right. Yeah.
But in other words, I think that it's Trinitarian in the sense that Jesus is the Logos. In other words, there's a filling out. The language is perfectly adequate as the medium in which God comes to us, but language per se does not encompass, reduce, define, or encapsulate, codify God.
I think somewhere in there is some of my critique about equationism with physics too, by the way. You know,
Absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely. That's it. That's it.
Yeah,
In other words, the I think mathematics in its left brain tendencies is on the order of the letter of the law.
exactly, exactly. And yet that's the dominant view that again, theologians are too afraid. I'm sorry to say, I don't want to make that as a like a insult, but they're just too timid or too mimetically afraid to challenge physics because they buy into that very worldview that, oh, I will not dare question those equations. Those look very impressive and very, very worldly esteemed. I mean, I don't want to touch that. And that becomes, I know there's other issues there before there, but I think that's the problem is that we are, it's easy to pick on theology, and it's easy to talk about what we got wrong theologically. But then when we start to scratch the surface of the anthropology that Rene Girard gave us, or what I'm trying to suggest, which is a Trinitarian physics, where we start to take the Trinity and look at it, physics and other things, and let it attach itself, let the Trinity inform our epistemology, including equationism, as I call it. I think we start to see that there's a lot of other modes of thought that are deeply inadequate for describing the way the reality is. Yeah,
Yeah. No, it's the we shouldn't expect the scientific failure to be much different than other human failures.
exactly. Yeah. But you would say then that are we in some sense, because you had mentioned earlier, maybe the universe is not meant to be understandable in that way. And I would say, yeah, I agree, but also no, because I do believe that God is, such as that let the little children come to me. This is what the kingdom of heaven is like. And I do believe that God's wisdom does confound the earthly wise, and it does bring us towards a more childlike understanding of the world.
I always think of, when Karl Barth came to the United States and the reporters, interviewed him. And of course, he was known for being very, very erudite and complicated. But one of the reporters said, well, can you reduce this down so that we can all understand it? And he said, Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. In other words, this is approachable. There's an entree into it, and that all of this then I think has not to reduce everything to pragmatics, but I think that there is an entry point into that yes, it is approachable through that. These are things that in some way, the way I always tell this, the way I introduced, in fact, my article on Desmond. I think I was about 13 when I became a Christian, and I knew nothing about Christianity. This was all new to me. And we were out in Texas, and I had a horse. I'd go ride my horse out in the middle of nowhere. And as a 13-year-old kid, I just had the experience of God in nature, that the world was lit up with the grandeur of God for me in a way that it had never been before. I think that as a child, that I had this experience that was just a true experience, that it's taken me a lifetime to come to apprehend and understand. I was kind of lured out of that childlike understanding, uh, going to Bible college and seminary and all of that. But I think that in my old age, I've kind of worked my way back uh, to the encounter with God in the
Yeah,
world in the eyes of a child.
that's very well said. With Rene Girard, just to add one more Trinitarian cherry on this conversation, I think about the inverted, you know, triune relationship that Rene Girard describes with mimetic rivalry and scapegoating. That there's this object that we desire, and that object of desire can be a person,
Uh-huh.
or it can be an actual object or thing that somebody has. But in that you have a triune kind of dynamic. But it's an
Right.
inverted sense. It's a violent sense. It's a desire for, you know, I want this object that this other person has, or I want this girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever that this other person has. And there's this kind of tripartite dynamic that can end in violence or the ejection of one, and that scapegoating expulsion dynamic. But
Absolutely. Absolutely.
there's also the positive Trinitarian mimesis that's going on in everyday life, which we commonly call networking. And that's where two people are brought together by a third person's relationship. And the relationships that interpenetrate every one of those people that are brought together by families and communities together. And that's the good thing. That's why the Holy Spirit is both a person and a relationship, right?
Yeah. Well, that's good. And I think that you can almost understand the positive in a better, deeper sense through the negative, and that is that the absence of God has a Trinitarian impact that Gerard describes, that Paul is describing in being pitted against himself. That is, that we kind of break apart, but instead of a relational understanding of, there is a disrelation, there is alienation, and that alienation penetrates deep. In other words, it's alienation from God, from other people, but it's ultimately an alienation that penetrates to the depth of who and what we are. And so, once we understand, oh, this thing pertains to everything about what it means to be human, that I think Gerard captures that. But then you fill in the absence of God with God's presence, and everything is transformed. No longer, and this is the meaning of reconciliation. This is the meaning of forgiveness. You know, actually, this again, that Hegel just pictures himself as working out the doctrine of reconciliation.
Very good. I really appreciate your time, sir. Thank you. How can people, any last thoughts or how people might stay in touch with you?
Yeah, but don't hesitate to write me. They can write me at paulvaxton@gmail.com. If anybody's interested in taking one of our classes through Plowshares Bible Institute, they can do that. And I hope they'll follow us, follow Forging Plowshares. We put out a couple of podcasts a week, and try to put out a blog a week. So yeah, just you can subscribe to that blog then.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dave. Good talking.